Good afternoon. My name is Kaija, and I'm Head of Digital Identity Technologies here at Cybernetica. It is my pleasure to talk to you all this afternoon, and I would like to introduce what we have to offer regarding digital identity, but also to speak a little about how we see digital identity and what is important in the field of digital identity in our opinion. When it comes to digital identity, or in fact, any other identification, it is always important to make sure that, or the purpose is to make sure that the person is who they claim to be. But there is always another purpose as well. When I'm identified, for example, in the real life situation by the bank clerk or by the border guard official, I also want them to make sure that no one else can claim to be me. So it is the same in the digital world. When a person is identified by a digital identity, the service provider wants to be sure that I am who I claim to be. But at the same time, they also need to make sure that no one else can claim to be me, because I want to be the only one using my identity. And therefore, for digital identity, it is important to have the technology in place, which can enable the identification securely and can enable that it is securely identified that the person is who they claim to be. But at the same time, that technology would need to have procedures and regulatory framework around to enable that, to fulfill that other purpose, which is to make sure that no one else can claim to be me. When setting up the digital identity service, there are 3 layers that needs to be considered. Firstly, it is important to know who the person is and to have the proper identity management services in place. It may be a population registry operated by the government. It may be something else, but you can't have digital identity without having the identity management in place, because you would need to make sure that if you issue the digital identity, you issue it to the same person that has the identity in real life. The other layer in the identity management field would be the issuing the credential tools. Now, previously, it has been mainly the passports and also the ID cards. But today, as the technology has evolved, it is also digital identities in the form of smartphone-based identities and things like that. But issuing these identity tools or credentials need to comply with certain procedures, again, in order to make sure that it is only that person who can get the identity who has the same identity in the real life as well. And the third layer in the identity management structure would be thinking through and developing services that would enable the usage of that identity credential, because there's no point to issue identity credentials if you don't have services that enable the usage of those identity credentials. And that's the end purpose of any identity system, that you issue some sort of tool that the person can use to verify their identity in the real life situations. Previously, it's been mainly the passport that you use when you cross the borders, but at today's world, it is also your digital identity that you can use when you want to authenticate yourself in digital services, or when you want to give your digital signature instead of your handwritten signature. Digital identity can have several different benefits. You may want to set up digital identity thinking of just one purpose, but at the same time, you will achieve other purposes as well. And it would be good to think through what is your main purpose to implement the digital identity, because for different societies, it may be different. What works for one society may not work entirely the same way to the other society. So first of all, digital identity needs to be inclusive. The same is for the identity documents in the real world, that you should be able to issue the identity documents to a certain group of people, but you would need to think through how you would make sure that this digital identity is inclusive, doesn't discriminate anybody, and is available to everybody who would want to use that. It is also important to have trust in the whole system of digital identity. There must be some sort of anchor of trust that enables you to make sure that when using digital identity, you can be sure that it is as secure as identifying the person face-to-face in real life. Digital identity would also need to be interoperable, meaning that it needs to be usable in the public services and in the private sector services. Initially, it may make sense to set up digital identity for just one service, but it can be scalable. And if you've already issued one digital identity, it makes sense to enable people to use it in several different services. Security is also one of the key components when it comes to digital identity. It comes back to the two principles that I mentioned earlier, which is that the purpose of digital identity is to make sure that I am who I claim to be, but also to make sure that no one else can claim to be me. So embedding that security into the digital identity system is important when it comes to technology, but also when it comes to procedures and the legislation around that. But digital identity also needs to be transparent. I want to know how my data is used. And I want to also know how it is made sure that my colleague can't use my identity or somebody else. So it needs to be transparent and controllable. And also empowerment. It is possible to build different services and tools on top of the digital identity system that you have created. And it also helps you to grow your businesses and to enable the growth of digital economy. Because the simple fact is, if you have digital identity, you don't need to open up so many service points, as you don't need to ask your customers always to visit your service point or your office. You can enable transactions remotely, which cuts back expenses for you, but also for your clients, since they don't need to travel to visit your offices and do the transactions. The digital identity technology that we are offering and that we are going to explain in a minute is compliant to the EU eIDAS regulation, but also the Payment Services Directive. It has been certified, it has been checked, and it corresponds to all the requirements that are needed in those EU regulations. We can also confidently say that it is cost efficient and it's quite easy to deploy. Much easier than the conventional token-based digital identity that has been used so far. So instead of issuing card-based digital identities, it is quite easy to set up your smartphone-based digital identity, and it is also easier for the customer who only needs to download the information to their smartphone, and you just need to think through how you identify the same person in the real life and tie that identity to their digital identity. And yes, we have several references in the Nordic banks and also in the leading telcos, and the practice shows that it cuts back expenses, it makes life easier, and the clients are quite happy if they don't need to visit for simple transactions your offices. The digital identity department in Cybernetica has quite interesting and very knowledgeable team. We have experts that have worked previously in the public sector. We have researchers, project managers, security engineers. We're able to provide consultancy. So in many cases, it is not, the customer does not yet know how they would need to set up the service. And in a lot of cases, there are some sort of components already in place, and often the customer doesn't want to change those components. So we are able to advise how to build on those identity management components and create your best digital identity service. We also work together with the partners quite a lot, who enable us to provide additional technologies which are needed to setting up digital identity, because for digital identity, you don't only need the technology for the identification, but you also may need a certification service, registration service, identity management services, and so on. So our partners, for example, IDEMIA and also Amazon Web Services, can help to create the comprehensive service. And we work together quite a lot with regional partners in different parts of the world. And of course, the Estonian government institutions are also very important partner for us. And together with them, we analyze the current services that are in place, try to identify the gaps, and try to advise them how to develop the system further. Thank you. And I will let my colleague Max to continue in the technical, on the technical issues of the digital identity service.